Good evening, everyone, and thanks again for sticking through the presentation. Um, in this second half of the workshop, we'll be talking about how to develop your scope and budget for your mini grant application. Next slide, please. All right, so our agenda for tonight, we will give an overview of the scope and budget and then dive into the components of the scope. And so we present to you with this information with, the hope in mind is that we hope to create a more smooth and efficient application process by cutting down the time frame from the back and forth communications between our staff and your organization. So what's really good about the mini grant program, as well as the refill station grant program, is that it really offers this unique opportunity for us to kind of work closely with you, from the time you submit your application to the time we execute an agreement. So we want to be there for you and help you shape your projects in the best position it can be to receive the grant funds. So after we give an overview of the scope and budget, we'll explore the budget and discuss what type of costs should be included and how they can be organized to align with your scope. Lastly, we'll recap with how the scope and budget are intertwined and then end off with some important reminders before we open up to any more questions that you may have. As always, feel free to engage with us at any point during the presentation using the Q&A or raising your hands. Next slide, please. And, just a reminder, probably engraved in your heads by now, but we use Flex as our main way to administer and receive applications. So you could, get started today and register yourself. And if you need any technical assistance, we're here to help you. And additionally, as another reminder, the terms and framework that we'll be using today, that we'll be presenting to you in these next few slides, are aligned with what we currently use in the agreement that we make. So once our programs have completed the redesign process, all of these components will be factored into the application to be more streamlined for what we look for in the agreement. So that's just a little heads up that some of these things might look a little different as we complete our redesign process. All right, so overview of the scope and budget. So the scope outlines 3 important things about your project. It identifies the project's objectives and deliverables. It defines your key tasks and milestones, and it highlights the project's purpose and impact. The budget is a summary of the major expense categories and funding sources that ensure success to completing your project. So it includes both your cash expenses as well as your in-kind contributions, which we will be going over more in depth later on in this presentation. The budget directly aligns with what is listed in your agreement, and we do have a template for the budget and how you could kind of add up all the numbers, and that is also on our online resource page for you to download and use if you wish. Next slide, please. And then I'll pass it over to Diana to bring us through the scope.
Thanks, Robert. So in reviewing many applications and putting together a lot of agreements, we realized that it would be helpful to set up a scope framework that most mini grants could utilize. There is flexibility, however, we recommend using this framework for a smoother, more effective application and eventual agreement. We hope this framework will help organizations think of all the inputs and outputs of the project. So the framework includes the background, upper left text box, and that highlights the purpose of your project. It also includes project objectives, lower left, and that is basically the clear and measurable goals that the project aims to achieve. And tasks, we're going to cover that a little bit more in detail, but tasks up on the upper right, those are activities that will be done to meet the project objectives. They describe the activity, the deliverable, and the timeline when the task will take place. And the expected outcomes, lower right, anticipated results or impacts of the project. Dive in a little more on tasks. So tasks are activities that include deliverables and timelines that are needed to ensure your project's success. And as a tip for your deliverables, make sure when you're making your deliverables, the outcomes, that they're realistic, achievable, and measurable. As mentioned earlier, the tasks in your scope can be organized into this framework. We'd like to call these like buckets. Each one is a bucket. And the next few slides, we'll talk more about which each task is and what they include. So the first task or category bucket, we call it, is planning and design. And that is where activities include like obtaining the site permissions we mentioned earlier, developing your plans, purchasing and designing materials, training your staff or volunteers. And if let's use an example, let's say you have a community garden project. So maybe this task might include like drafting garden layouts or obtaining necessary permits. Next category is our outreach category or bucket. And this covers tasks that are related to engaging with stakeholders for your project. Some examples can include like developing an outreach plan or materials for your project, like flyers, brochures, handouts, journals, advertisements, social media boosts, staff and volunteer hours for outreach, hosting a community meeting, like a planning meeting, that can all be an outreach. Like, for example, if your project includes a workshop like promoting environmental conservation, some outreach tasks might include distributing informational flyers, engaging local media outlets, or posting on social media. The third category is implementation. This is where the actual execution of your project takes place. This can include the workshop that you planned, organizing and conducting the cleanup, installing the mural, conducting pre- and post-event surveys, construction, planting vegetation or trees. Let's use this community garden example again. So implementation tasks could include things like preparing the soil, building the raised beds, and installing the irrigation system. Lastly, we have our evaluation bucket. And this is basically where tasks are focused on assessing the effectiveness and impact of your project once it's complete. It can include items like collecting and analyzing data gathered from surveys. It can be preparing or writing any written reports or presentations, and collecting testimonials and conducting interviews with participants or stakeholders. Back to our community garden example. Tasks could include something like water usage or surveys assessing feedback from the community the garden serves. The next slide here, this is a screenshot taken from the online Flex application where you'll be entering information. This is where you will list your tasks, planning, design, outreach, implementation, and evaluation assessment. And it's where you will provide a brief description of the activity, including any significant outcomes here on the left side, and then the time frame in which the task will be done. That's the start and end dates on the right. For demonstration purposes, we have pre-filled this table to show you what it would look like if it followed the 4 categories or buckets that I mentioned in previous slides. So planning and design would look like this. Part of your task is you would include staff will conduct a site survey to assess soil. And then outreach would include something like staff and volunteers organize 2 community meetings, promote the events through social media and distributed flyers. The implementation, staff and volunteers will build and raise the beds and prepare the soil for planting, approximately 30 species of native plants. And evaluation, staff will conduct a survey to assess the community garden satisfaction and usage of the garden. And there's a few things you can do, include your scope, to help develop a great scope. One suggestion, now these are helpful but not mandatory, so this is the suggestions. If you provide the program to disadvantaged communities, that's a plus. Providing materials or program in more than one language. Obtaining photo releases from parents, staff, or participants in advance to help us when you're sharing your photos with us, that we can use them on for publish on our website. And then providing detailed demographic information about the community served, number of students and community members. So that was a lot of information. So we have a little practice activity. So I want you to guess which bucket you think it goes into, either planning, outreach, implementation, or evaluation. You can type it in the chat if you'd like, or just guess. So the first one is, I got permission to use the community center for the summer camp. Would that be planning, outreach, implementation, or evaluation? If you guess planning, you're right. Next one, volunteers help participants on an educational hike. Where does it go? I think that would be implementation. So next would be program staff send out an email blast as part of the project's outreach. There's a clue in there. What part would that go into? That would be outreach. Great. Next one, analyze survey results which showed that 99% of the participants enjoyed the activity. Wow, 99% is a great number. Where would that go? Think about it for a second. Yep, evaluation. You're right. And here's a good one. Staff will prepare the curriculum that will be taught in classrooms. What would that be? That's something you do in advance, maybe planning. If you guess planning, you're right. And the next one, pre and post-event surveys are administered to the participants. This is kind of a trick question. Sounds like evaluation, but since it happens during the program, it would be implementation. Here's a good one. Registration period is open. That can be in different spaces, but we usually suggest it should go into outreach because this is when you're communicating with the audience, trying to, get them to sign up for your program. Here's a good one. We posted the testimonials on our website. Yeah, evaluation. That's right. Thanks for going along this quick little quiz with me. I'll pass it over to Robert, who's going to cover budget.
Great. Thanks, Diana, for leading the activity. And I did see that we had someone keep up with you in the Q&A box. So great job. All right, so next section is the budget. And we'll dive into what makes up your project budget. Next slide, please. All right, so as an introduction to the budget, we'd first like to talk about the total project cost and how that is associated with how much mini grant funding you can receive for your project. So the total project cost refers to the entire cost it will take to carry out your project. And this will include any materials, labor, or any other relevant costs that we will be discussing in the next few slides. So for our mini grant programs, we calculate, the amount that you're eligible for by using a formula. We take your total project cost and we multiply that by 75% to figure out whether or not you meet that threshold of receiving the full $5,000 or if you might fall under that. So to make it easier for you all, we do have a figure, a minimum total project cost figure that qualifies you to receive the full mini grant award. So that figure is $6,667. And that, anything above that, you are basically eligible for the full $5,000. But anything below that, we use that formula again to calculate how much you are eligible for. So as an example, let's say your total project cost is $7,000. The amount that you're eligible for is the full $5,000 because when we take 75% of the $7,000, that gives us $5,250, as you see in the slide. And that's way above the threshold for the $5,000 cap that we have for mini grants. So we just give you the full grant amount. Additionally, for our mini grants, as mentioned in the first half of the presentation, we do require that 25% match fund. And this comes from your in-kind and monetary contributions. And that is 25% of the total project cost. So 25% of $7,000 in this example gives you $1,750. And we'll talk more about that in the next few slides. But if you have any questions about calculating this or figuring out where your project falls under, or what falls under your total project cost, you could always reach out to us and we'll help you explore those options as well. Next slide, please. All right, so moving on to the different categories that fall within your project budget, we'll explore two different kinds. So the first one is monetary. So monetary expenses refer to the cash expenses associated with your project. These are typically straightforward and they could easily be tracked through receipts and invoices. And examples of these costs include paid personnel, facility rental fees, purchased materials, paid transportation costs, and any permitting fees that your project requires. We also have in-kind contributions, and these are your non-monetary resources that go into your project, but they also have an impact on the total project cost. So examples of your in-kind contributions include volunteer labor, donations, supplies or assistance provided to the project free of charge, or any shared facilities, equipment, or vehicles. And on this slide, you'll see there's a link there that shows you how to calculate volunteer time. So if your project or organization is heavily reliable on or reliant on volunteers to carry out any type of work, we highly encourage you to add that as an in-kind contribution. Using that link there, it helps you kind of calculate that cost. And it's also in the chat as well. Next slide, please. All right, so this table is a screenshot taken directly from our mini grant application on Flex. It is where you basically fill out all of the monetary and in-kind costs in your budget table. So this is part of like a budget table in your application. So as you see here in the example, the source usually comes from the applicant organization. So this is where you would put your organization, and then the monetary line, there is any amount that your organization is contributing to the project. So any cash, any purchases that your organization is making, we ask that you put that total in that line there. As for the line below that, the in-kind contributions, those are, as we mentioned in the previous slides, like any volunteer labor or any other donations that you are contributing. And for your project funding sources, you could have more than one source. So, it could also come from maybe a different organization that you're working with, or another grant or anything like that. We, just ask that you list that down as another source and include whether or not they're contributing any type of monetary contributions or donations. So, doing that kind of will help you, add those up and see where you fall under. But we just ask that the sum of your monetary and in-kind contributions are equal to 25% of your total project cost. So I hope that makes sense. But we do have another practice activity in the next few slides. So for this activity, we'll just kind of have you guess what kind of cost this is. Monetary. So grantee staff worked for 4 hours toward this task. So it isn't monetary since this is staff work, and most likely staff is being paid, I hope. So this will count as your monetary task. Next slide. Volunteers helped register participants. So in kind or monetary, this is in kind because this is directly dealing with volunteer work. Great. So this example, complimentary transportation was provided by another organization. This would be in kind. Great, because it is basically provided by another organization. In this scenario, we're assuming they're kind of donating it. That cost is covered by them and not part of the grant funds that you're requesting. So this would be in kind. All right, so this one, contracted buses were hired to transport people. This would be monetary because you're contracting buses, you're paying that out-of-pocket expense, and then you list that as a line item on your budget table. And then program guides help guide participants. So this one's a little bit of a tricky gray area, but this could be in kind. So, unless they are paid, then it's monetary. So program guides, if they're volunteers, this would be considered in kind. But if you have staff who are also your program guides or you're hiring program guides, then that would be monetary. All right, and then last one, project partially funded by another grantor. This would be monetary. Great. All right, so now that we went over the scope and budget, we will recap on how the two are interconnected. So as mentioned, the scope outlines the tasks, deliverables, and timelines, and they can be organized into the buckets that Diana was talking about, which were your planning/design, outreach, implementation, and evaluation. As for the budget, these are the costs that go into your project. And as you are developing your budget, you can align, all of your tasks into those buckets. And it's also reflected in the table that we will be showing you in the next slide. Great. So in this example, we'll take a look at the tables from earlier to see how the two sections are connected. So on the left hand of the slide, we could see the tasks that we've talked about. So for planning design, outreach and implementation, those are organized into the three buckets, and you could see a little bit of the brief description there in blue. On the right hand side of the slide, we can see how that first task, planning and design, is broken down into the corresponding funding sources. So for instance, for task 1, planning and design, the content materials and mockups correspond to line item 1 in the budget table that you see on the right-hand side of the screen. And this covers all the activities and tasks that go into this phase of the project. So the grantee contribution, which is mentioned earlier, is a combination of both the in-kind and monetary funding sources, is $800. That's specific just for this task. And then the Valley Water request, or the water grant amount that will be used to cover this task, is $2,500. And so this is just kind of like a general sense of how you could organize your scope and budget and how they are connected. And we do kind of recommend following this similar format, just because it's easier when it comes to the agreement, making the agreement and moving it forward to executing the project. So you would kind of do this similarly for each task in your scope, and then just breaking it down into how much money is coming from the grantee contribution and how much of the grant funds you're going to be using for that specific task. Next slide, please. And then I'll pass it over to Diana to give us one last practice activity.
Practice makes perfect. So here's a practice activity. We're going back to our community garden we kind of talked about earlier. So I'm just going to propose a scenario, and I'm going to ask some questions. So in this scenario, a nonprofit has a project that would involve using an existing location and include demonstrations on water saving and environmentally sustainable garden components. What kind of activities and project costs would go into planning? Let's think about it for a second. We hinted earlier, something like permission to use the site. It's an existing location. Do you have permission to use that location? Creating the demonstration materials, getting all that stuff prepared, purchasing the supplies for the garden, training your staff and volunteers, designing the garden layout, purchasing compost demonstration buckets, anything like that that goes into preparing for the implementation portion for your actual garden event. The next one is outreach. So what kind of activities that you think would go into outreach? Just think about it for a second. Same example, community garden, maybe preparing your outreach plan. Like, who are we going to communicate, when, what are we going to say? Getting those social media posts ready. Social media is everywhere. So getting all that ready. And then considering, hey, I really want to boost this, social media posts, and planning for that. Also, paying for the advertisements. Like if you want to put an ad in a paper or something like that, that's part of outreach. And then let's just say you want to have some of your materials translated. This would be a good place for it too in outreach, depending on the material. This translation might go into planning, depending on what you're translating. The third bucket, implementation. So what kind of activities in that community garden can you imagine? Like actually holding the demonstration. Like when people show up for your garden project, asking them before, hey, what do you know about sustainable gardening? And then after, what did you learn? How much more do you know? That's where your pre and post surveys would come in implementation. And then also the actual volunteers or staff that actually attended the event and helped you out. So stuff like that would go into implementation. And then evaluation. Here's where you want to, kind of put your surveys, anything you did like after the event, you sent out a survey, said, hey, what you guys think, rating it, that could go here in evaluation. Sometimes those surveys give you good information to improve your program in the future. testimonials, like you've asked people after to give you like either a video or a written testimonial about the program. Any reports you want to prepare, a summary based on your project, data analysis, like for this example of the garden, like how much water did it save over the last month if you compare, and then the effectiveness, and then water usage data. So that's kind of examples of how you would sketch out that scope and budget. And if you, like I said, if you need help along the way when you're doing your application, you can always let us know. And passing it over to Robert, who's going to give you some important reminders.
Great, thanks, Anna. So as you prepare your scope and budget, it is important to keep in mind some of the do's and don'ts that are required for our mini grant program. So we specifically require that your projects do not contain any advocacy, lobbying efforts, or any other political component. We also do, encourage you to refrain from any proselytizing of any sort for any grant projects. Your deliverables must be realistic, achievable, and demonstratable. Your project must be accessible by the public. And lastly, your insurance and general overhead costs cannot be included in the budget. That's a couple of the items that are not eligible costs for the requested grant award. All right, next slide. All right, so that basically concludes the presentation for tonight. As Amy mentioned, we do have this survey that we would love to get your feedback on any aspect of the workshops that you participated in tonight. Any comment would help us, definitely improve and hear back from what you have to say. So the link is also in the chat, and we'll also be emailing this out if you'd like to take that. And I'll pass it off to Diana to close us off with some of our contact information once again.
Yeah, thank you so much for attending tonight. We really appreciate your interest and taking the time to spend with us to go through this. And we're here to support you throughout this process. And so please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions. The quickest response is we suggest you email us, grants@valleywater.org. Our whole team has access to this email box, and we can respond quickly. You can also call us on our hotline. That's the number, the 630-2080. And if you have any specific questions or need personalized assistance, you can schedule a meeting with us on our website, and we're here to help you. We really want to help you get your project off the ground and accepted. So at any time, always please reach out to us. We're more than happy to help. Thank you. And now we can open it up for any questions that you may have.
I just wanted to add, as the team said, we're here to help. You don't have to be an expert grant writer. Maybe this is your first time. We're not going to reject your application or anything like that. We're here to work with you. Don't need to be a budget expert or an Excel whiz. We're here. You guys are kind of already ahead of the curve here by attending the workshop. And a lot of these tips that you heard today are good tips for any kind of grant that you may be applying for. So just wanted to throw that out there. Don't be intimidated. We are here to help. All right. Not seeing anything come in, so we can go ahead and wrap up. We'll stay on for a couple more minutes, but feel free to log off if you have any questions. Again, feel free to. Oh, do we have some?
We do have a question. Would the mini grant cover something like Adopt a Creek?
Oh, that is a really good question. And the answer is probably not, most likely not. Again, every project is going to be different, but the Adopt a Creek is really intended to be volunteer, and we provide free of charge the supplies, materials. So as part of that general program, if you're thinking of Adopt a Creek, that's may not work out. There is possibility of different kind of cleanup and educational events outside of that program. So I'd encourage you to check in with us, send us an email, set up an appointment. But specific to the Adopt a Creek program, we can't provide funding for a volunteer program where we're providing supplies and everything. That's a really good question. So hopefully that answers that.
We did get another question. Will the recording be available? Yes, we're gonna be uploading the recording onto YouTube as well as the presentation, and that will be included as part of our follow-up email.